My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Advise Consent, the 1962 political drama about a confirmation hearing.
Alan Drury's Advise and Consent. From the time this novel of Washington was first published, it held the #1 spot on all of America's bestseller lists for more than 70 weeks during 1959 and 1960, creating unprecedented national interest from all over the world.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who has plenty of youthful indiscretions in his past. Jim, is there anything you'd like to come clean about now before your confirmation hearing?
Well, there's so much, Gary. I don't know where to begin, but since this is a podcast dealing with presidents, I'll confess that I actually supported Jerry Ford over Ronald Reagan for the presidential nomination in 1976. Are you going to come clean with me on that, or do you have something else?
Well, I will come clean with you on that, and I will see you and up you one. It's time for me to come clean and admit that my first vote ever was for a Democrat. Back in 1972, Massachusetts had an open primary, and because Nixon was running unopposed on the Republican side, I asked for a Democratic ballot and voted for Senator Scoop Jackson to be the Democratic presidential nominee. So I started off my voting career, with the first of many lost causes.
And Scoop Jackson was actually in this movie in a cameo. I just read about it. I didn't actually see him.
I didn't notice I think he's probably in the audience or something like that.
Yeah, I thought your confession was going to be that you have nothing to confess, which in itself is kind of an embarrassing confession.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. I mean, to have nothing in your past is kind of a admission that you've been a nerd. You're a little goody two shoes your entire life, and I guess that's me. So this movie is based on the enormously successful political novel by Alan Drury, who covered the Senate for the New York Times in the 1950s. This was one of my favorite books when I was growing up. What about you? Did you have any kind of relationship to the novel or movie before we started it, before we watched it?
I've never seen the movie, and I've never actually read the novel. I'm embarrassed to say, speaking of confessions. I do like political and doomsday type thrillers, including some of the films that came out at the same time as Advise and Consent. And going forward, I loved all the fictionalized Watergate type movies like Washington Behind Closed Doors, that miniseries. I love 24 and the House of Cards. So I certainly like the genre.
Well, I'm gonna show you again what a nerd I was. Back when I was in ninth, 10th, 11th grade, half of what I learned about the government came from reading huge, thick novels like Advise and Consent, Night at Camp David, The Man, 7 Days in May, and Armageddon. And I liked Advise and Consent so much that I also read the 3 additional sequels, which were of diminishing quality. These are all 1,000-page books, and I have to ask myself, I mean, when did I have time to read all this stuff? Because I wasn't just reading political novels, but I never saw the movie. I wasn't even aware that there was a movie until way past the time when I would have watched something like this. So,
Well, I was reading 1,000-page books too, but guess what? They were Ayn Rand.
yeah, okay, okay. Well, it was my idea to suggest Advise and Consent. The idea came to me when I listened to a podcast about Otto Preminger, the director, which got me thinking about the great political movies of the 1960s. Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, The Original Manchurian Candidate, 7 Days in May. What do you think it was about that time that provided such a rich environment for political movies?
I think it's a mix of a number of things. You had the Cold War, you had the threat of nuclear annihilation, which, as you remember from being a kid, was a big, big deal, especially with the Soviets matching us in nuclear power. You had a communist takeover in Cuba, 90 miles away. The idea that the generals and the military industrial complex were gaining too much power, and even Eisenhower called them out on that. And you had the threats to the status quo and the way of life of some Americans through the civil rights movement. A little later, you had the rise of Goldwater, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination. I mean, the list of things to scare people on all sides of the political spectrum was enormous.
All right. Well, I think you put your finger on it. I agree. I agree with everything you say. And I know these kids today think they live in dangerous times because the Earth's temperature might go up 2 degrees over the next 60 years. But we grew up in a time of real existential fears, nuclear war and communist takeover of the world, as you mentioned. This was a time where it seemed possible that the world could end at any time. And I think those fears are reflected in some of these movies.
Yeah, I agree. It did sort of breed a paranoia among people. And in fact, the Professor Richard Hofstadter wrote a seminal essay in 1964, actually called "The Paranoid Style in American Politics." And you see those impulses reflected in movies like this one and in the other movies that we've mentioned. Of course, like any good liberal professor, he pretty much confined the paranoia to the right wing,
Right.
because, of course, left wingers always deal with the facts and never succumb to conspiracy theories. But nonetheless, it was an important essay and made some good points about the climate of the times.
Yeah, and I would say this movie is actually not the most conspiratorial or paranoid of all the movies we'd seen. I mean, 7 Days in May, Doctor Strangelove, all those movies are, very much, a lot more tense than this movie.
Yeah.
It's a straightforward political. It's not even a thriller, even, but there's still a lot of. I mean, communism is like spread fear of communism is spread throughout this entire movie, and that's a major point.
The other thing these movies do that's sort of interesting is they take elements of film noir, but instead of a femme fatale or somebody like that being the antagonist, it's some madman general.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting combination of a 50s stylistic in film with an early 60s sort of general cultural paranoia.
All right. Well, I think you're right about that. And let's talk about the movie itself. I believe it is
Yeah.
my turn to do the summary.
Yeah, I think you're the bigger expert since you've read the book and seen the movie, and I've just seen the movie. So, what do you have?
Okay. Advise and consent are the words used in the Constitution to describe the process by which the U.S. Senate must confirm major presidential nominations, including cabinet members. Henry Fonda plays Robert Leffingwell, a peace-seeking liberal who is nominated as Secretary of State by a seriously ill president who wants Leffingwell to carry on his legacy. In the subsequent confirmation process, we see a gallery of saints and sinners grapple with his controversial choice. At the extremes, we see two amoral senators, the anti-communist Steve Cooley from South Carolina and the peacenik Fred Van Ackerman from Wyoming, who between the two of them will use every dirty trick at hand to either kill or guarantee the nomination. In the middle is the righteous Brigham Young Anderson from Utah, who is asked to run the confirmation hearings. When Anderson learns that Leffingwell lied at the hearing about belonging to a communist cell in his youth, he demands that the president pull the nomination, which he refuses to do. As Anderson struggles with his moral responsibility to tell the truth about Leffingwell, he is also being blackmailed by an anonymous caller who threatens to expose a dark secret from his own past, a homosexual affair when he was in the army. Caught in a moral dilemma, he decides he'd rather slit his throat in his Senate's office building than have his past exposed. With Anderson's moral qualms out of the way, the president pushes forward with a Senate vote. It ends in a tie, and before the vice president can break the tie, the president drops dead, and the motion to consent to the nomination fails.
Thank you for that, Gary. I now actually understand this movie and who was for what and who was against what, which is one of the things I found sort of confusing. But how did the movie do?
It was only a modest hit, considering this was a huge, gigantic bestseller. Had a box office of $1.5 million, which is okay. This 1.5 million compares to the number one movie of the year, Spartacus, which brought in 13.5 million. more than 10 times as much, followed by West Side Story, two Doris Day movies, Lover Come Back, and That Touch of Mink, and The Music Man. So, although we talk about the paranoid style and these movies being controversial, and the top movies were still, you know,
Escapism.
escapism, except for Spartacus. Spartacus is
Yeah.
a Stanley Kubrick movie with real themes that you could probably parlay into some commentary on the time. But the Doris Day movies and The Music Man are definitely escapist. And I got decent, but not glowing reviews. The New York Times called it sassy and stinging before bemoaning its salaciousness and cynicism. It was shut out at the Academy Awards that year with zero nominations.
That's interesting because the book won the Pulitzer Prize and the movie got zero nominations. And I, reflecting on the movie, I think it's kind of a hard book to translate to the screen because the messages are sort of muddled and the who's good and who's bad are muddled as well. And it's hard to, it doesn't really pull at your heartstrings. It doesn't ring partisan bells one way or the other in a strong sense. So left with a kind of middling muddle of a story, in my view.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the movie, as I said, I mean, the book rather was, I don't know, 900 pages or something. And you really get drawn into a world and you come to know these characters deeply. And, the plot spools out in a rational tone or rational pace. In the movie, of course, everything's bing, bing, bing. And you're like jumping back and forth. And it's like, what happened? What happened?
Yeah,
Uh,
you almost need a scorecard, or I did at the beginning anyway.
Yeah. Now, in the book, of course, in the front of the book, there's a list of all the characters. And some of these, that's what they used to do back then. Can you imagine if they did that with The Great Gatsby? Daisy Buchanan, or, but like Senator Steve Cooley, Democrat,
Yeah,
and all the, it's like a list of 25 names. So when you're reading the book, you can go back and see. So,
that would have helped here.
yeah,
What do
we
you
could have.
think? I wanted to ask you, what do you think of Otto Preminger in general as a movie maker and director?
Well, he was, I would say, next to Alfred Hitchcock, the most famous director of the 50s and 60s. He was even Mr. Freeze in Batman. He acted in a couple of things. He played,
Yeah,
yeah, he was, so he played in Batman. He was famous for being a dictatorial director
and
and like,
Bully.
yeah, bully. Yeah, another way to put that. I have not seen a lot of his movies. I did just see Exodus, which is about the founding of Israel, which is a better movie than this.
He tended to go for edgy kind of
Yeah,
subjects for the times,
yeah,
anyway.
yeah,
Anatomy of a Murder, Man with a Golden Arm,
yeah,
drug addiction. Even Exodus, in addition to the drama of the creation of Israel, had like this movie did, had a gay subplot. And the Oscar nominated Sal Mineo gave an amazing speech in the movie about how he basically pleasured the concentration camp guards in order to save his own life. And so he tended to reach for that kind of stuff, no matter what the movie was about on the surface.
right. It was
He,
a
he
message movie. I think his movies have not held up quite as well as Hitchcock's. I mean, we're still studying Hitchcock and obsessing about him. I mean, I've seen Laura, for example, which was one of his
yeah,
big, and if you asked me the plot, I couldn't remember it right now.
I do have to mention that he played the commandant in the movie Stalag 17,
Okay.
which was the precursor of Hogan's Heroes. And in fact, the writers of Stalag 17 ended up trying to sue Hogan's Heroes for infringement. But so Otto Preminger played the very first Commandant Wilhelm Klink. I couldn't come up with a Beatles connection for this movie, so I had to come up with a Hogan's Heroes connection.
Yeah, well, I'm sure if we tried hard enough, we could probably get a James Bond one.
Yeah.
All right. So who would you recommend this movie to?
Well, I think those that like films about the inner workings of Washington, at least the way maybe it once was. people who are curious about the Senate Club and what it used to be like, those who want to get a sense of the paranoia surrounding the Cold War and communism and competing visions with how to deal with that, diplomacy or confrontation, and people that like a good political suspense movie.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would add social historians who want to understand the Cold War mentality. I,
Yeah.
I find it interesting to watch movies that are set during their contemporary times because you see what things used to look like and the way people used to think and talk. Even if it was filtered through Hollywood, it's still very interesting to
Yeah.
even look at the furniture and all that kind of thing. All right, so what's the movie trying to accomplish?
Well, to me, it showed that Washington is a complicated and pretty cynical place, and that underneath the surface friendliness, which people today yearn for the good old days of when the senators from both parties would get together and drink and play poker and all that. But beneath all that, there was unbelievable viciousness and cruelty to one another. I think it kind of showed that the culture of Washington politics and the Senate are creatures of their unto themselves. And the individual players that come and go really didn't matter that much. And you saw this at the end of the movie when the whole plot device was about the confirmation of this would-be Secretary of State. And then in a millisecond, the president who nominated him dropped dead, and the previously Casper Milquetoast vice president said, "I'm not going to break the tie to confirm him. I want my own man." So just like that, the whole plot was wiped out. And so I think that was deliberate. I think that was sort of what the movie was meant to show.
Yeah, in the next book, by the way, this guy, it's all about the next guy being president, that vice president
Oh,
being,
really?
and that's all the characters are back. They're all back. In the third book, the president ends up asking Leffingwell to be a Secretary of State, so he finally does get to be Secretary of State. So I think the movie ultimately wants us to grow up and not be naive about life or politics. Preminger, as we discussed, was famously an issues director focused on adult themes and taboos like addiction and racism. This movie prides itself on being the first movie to show the inside of a gay bar, but it's also a movie to make sure that we don't idealize government as if there ever was a time we did. It's something of an antidote to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. In that Frank Capra movie, an idealistic young man played by Jimmy Stewart is appointed senator, and when he fights corruption, he ultimately wins. In this case, the idealist kills himself, and only chance keeps the cynics from winning.
And I believe in it, sort of a touch of irony. They dust off the set from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and use the Senate chamber specifically and use it in this film. So
That would make
you have those two mirror opposite kinds of films operating in the same set.
I think the movie's also trying to point out that no side or ideology has a monopoly on virtue. Both the peace through strength and peace through surrender advocates act immorally.
Yeah.
And I think finally, like all good political movies, this one shows the need to compromise. The majority leader, Bob Munson, doesn't like the Leffington nomination, but agrees to promote it out of loyalty to the president. Brig Anderson, on the other hand, is so rigid and unforgiving with his sense of right and wrong that he's vulnerable when his own past is used against him.
Mm-hmm.
And it just occurred to me that his name is Brig, and is also, I almost said prig, which is kind of what he is, because he's a little
Yeah.
self-righteous. Well, what did you like about the movie?
Well, I always like to see films set in Washington.
Right.
It's especially sort of a time gone by. And I liked being reminded that in those days, the dynamics were such that the differences in the parties were more profound than differences between the parties,
Yeah.
especially the Democrats, but also the Republicans when it came to foreign affairs. And that was interesting to see. Most of all, I love trying to figure out which fictional character was meant to be which real character in real life. That was just fun, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it really was.
Yeah.
No, you're right about. I mean, we grew up in a time when, as you say, the differences within the parties were bigger than the ones among the parties. You'd have Democrats and Republicans on each side of the fence on a vote. You see this in the movie. I mean, the majority leader calls up the minority leader and says, "How many votes you got?" And, well, I've got 15 for, and he says, "Well, I've got 30 or whatever." And I mean, they were friendly enough to to talk like that. The president's party votes against him, and the opposition party votes with him. So it's and that's the way it used to be.
Yeah, and you see that see that especially in the civil rights issues.
Oh yeah,
And as you get further into the 60s, the 64 and such, where you had larger, on a percentage basis, larger parts of the Republican caucus voting for the main civil rights bills than the Democratic Party.
right, right. So I thought the plot moved along, and I was generally interested in what happened next.
Yeah,
I was glad not to be spoon-fed the plot. We're just dumped in the middle of the confirmation battle and have to figure out who's who and what's what. Um,
mm-hmm.
the review said it was too talky, and I know what they mean, but it's a movie that's basically a debate. It's bound to be talky, and I thought Preminger did a good job of using the camera to keep it visually interesting. So,
Yeah, yeah.
what didn't you like?
I thought on the whole, the characterizations were pretty shallow.
Hmm.
I was actually shocked by how small and shallow Fonda's role was. I mean, if you think about it, he was barely a presence in most of the film. They didn't even button down his part at the end to show his reaction to not becoming secretary. I mean, maybe this was deliberate. Maybe this was one of Drury's points that the stage and the setting are bigger than any one or two actors upon it. But I just was sort of disappointed, with the exception of Brigham Anderson, the senator who killed himself, where they did sort of dig deep into his psyche and his family life and his past and all that. I thought the characterizations were fairly shallow.
One of the things I liked that you have to work at it is also a bit of a dislike because so many names are thrown at you so fast, and the plot's a little bit convoluted. So, you have to work at it, but I think you kind of have to work at it a little too hard.
Yeah.
It also seems a little bit too cynical. Hardly anyone considering Leffingwell's nomination considers it on the merits, whether he'd be a good Secretary of State or not. And there's not a lot of discussion about his policy positions, just some glib answers about peace. So we don't really get a sense of the stakes.
Yeah, they don't really elucidate the differences that were being talked about in this and the other movies of the period, which is how much confrontation, how much accommodation with the communist world, and etc. And for modern audiences, myself included, where you see revolving doors in terms of cabinet officers in recent administrations, it's hard to get really worked up about. So the whole thing's about who's going to be a Secretary of State. It's hard to get too worked up about the stakes surrounding that. It was for me anyway.
No, I agree. It does seem like this is the main plot point. Although we have had several confirmation hearings in the past 25 years that were really hot button issues. So,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about those later. I didn't really like the denouement when the president died during the final vote. It's just too much of a fake way to build tension and then say, never mind, like, I mean, you are
Yeah.
kind of already made that point, but like,
But I actually, at first, I didn't like the dropping dead off screen in the Oval Office scene, but in a way, it was almost a Doctor Strange-Levian kind of dark humor.
yeah,
That all of a sudden you hear a thump off camera, and the president's dead, and I came to appreciate that upon reflection.
yeah, yeah. All right, let's talk about the actors.
Sure.
This is another movie with an all-star cast, although except for Henry Fonda, many of the actors are poorly remembered today. You've already talked about Henry Fonda. I agree with you. He's one of our greatest movie stars, but you're completely right that he was hardly in it. Considering that he's the focus of the debate. He's barely acting because Fonda was a real life liberal who promoted mainstream liberal causes like anti communism in real life. But and I gotta say, I did not care for his character. He lies about being a communist in his youth, and then apparently feels bad about it, which just wasn't convincing when it was played by Henry Fonda. I mean, the remorse, it just was unbelievable. I don't think it was like it was a very wooden performance, I thought.
Yeah, I think if you compare what he had to work with in this film to what he had to work with in Failsafe, where the denouement of that film was that because we had accidentally obliterated Moscow, in order to prevent total obliteration of both countries, the Fonda president there had to basically agree to have the U.S. demolish New York City and kill his own wife, the first lady, who was there. Now, all that's preposterous, but it's a lot more for an actor to work with that stuff than what he had in this film.
Well, and of course, he's an alumnus of the celluloid president because he played Abe Lincoln in Young Mr. Lincoln,
Where he was great.
where he was excellent, excellent. He's played another president too. He was in the disaster movie Meteor, which I've never
Yes.
seen or even heard of, really. All right, Charles Lawton, Senator Steve Cooley, the main opponent of Leffingwell's nomination. He was a major Hollywood presence in the 30s and 40s. He played Captain Bligh, Quasimodo, Henry VIII, Rembrandt, and Inspector Jarvet. Cooley was his last role. He had cancer when he was making the movie, and he died 6 months after the premiere.
Yeah, I thought he did a great job. Understanding by that, I mean, he chewed a lot of
Yeah.
scenery. He provided the entertainment value, such as it was. But on a more serious note, he played the part of a coiled snake really well, starting off with syrupy homilies from the South, and then suddenly launching into the most vicious, vitriolic kinds of rhetoric and character assassination. So I really enjoyed that character and enjoyed his performance.
I would say that this guy was doing a good Sam Irvin imitation,
Yeah,
except
that's
that
who I thought of.
Irvin didn't become famous as the chair of the Watergate subcommittee for another dozen years. And I got to be thinking, I wonder if Irvin was modeling himself on Steve Cooley. I wonder if he saw this movie and said, "Yeah, that's who I'm going to be," because everything down to the white suit and the
Yeah,
commentary on top of the syrupy stuff. I'm just a country lawyer kind of stuff.
right. And a raving racist,
And a
Irvin was,
raving racist
despite
too.
being heralded as a liberal hero in the 70s.
Yeah,
Go figure.
there you go, figure. Walter Pidgeon was the minority leader, Robert Munson. He was another major leading man during the golden age of Hollywood. Many of his movies are now forgotten, except for a few big hits like Mrs. Minerva and How Green Was His Valley. He's really the protagonist of the movie and the one who embodies the decency and values of the Senate. He's willing to compromise, but not too much, understands human nature, and will forgive venial sins, but not mortal sins. What do you
Yeah, I
think
thought
about?
he was very credible,
Yeah.
playing a substantive figure. You could actually believe, maybe except for some of the character flaws, that he was an LBJ type powerful majority leader. I thought he did a good job.
Yeah, I thought he was fine too. Now, the guy that plays Brigham Young Anderson, who's like the other, major character here, is Don Murray. He plays the idealistic chair of the subcommittee that investigates the Leffingwell nominations. He's one of these guys with a decent but not spectacular career. His first movie was in Bus Stop, opposite Marilyn Monroe. He was also in Knots Landing and just died last year in 2024.
And his character, we need to point out, was based on a sort of on a real life situation because It was Senator Lester Hunt of Wyoming
Right.
killed himself in his Senate office, not over his own gay peccadillo from the past, but his son's. And his son's reputation was, he was blackmailed over it. Hunt was. They tried to force him to resign and leave the Senate and all that. They think maybe McCarthy and Roy Cohn were involved in that. Um, and so there was some reality basis for the way that the character Brigham Young Anderson, played by Don Murray, Don Murray had a lot to work with in this film.
Yeah.
You
No,
know,
he
he
really
was,
did.
and I think he portrayed the encroaching dread and gloom and impossibility in his mind of his situation very well, offset by touching scenes with his family and all that. So I thought he did a good job.
Yeah, I mean, he's a tragic character. He's so
Yeah,
moral, upstanding, and sympathetic that he seems like the hero of the movie but he's too fragile and he cracks under the pressure to be the hero of his own story. I want to note that his first name is Brigham and that he's a senator from Utah. So he's presumably Mormon, but he only has one kid. This is the first tip off that he's got a gay past. The second was when he said
yeah,
when his wife says she knows they haven't had an exciting marriage. Like,
yeah.
what does that mean? Not an exciting marriage?
I know. No,
Uh,
there was some nuance there,
yeah, I was
and
like,
some
hmm,
not so nuance.
yeah. Anyone else you want to mention?
Well, I think this is the celluloid president, so we need to mention Franchot Tone, who
Hmm.
played the president in this film, and I thought he was pretty good as a fatalistic regarding his longevity, but stone cold and arrogant kind of president. The way he treated his vice president, disparaging and dismissing, which leads to speculation, given all the different character flavor we saw in him. Who do you think he was portraying, Gary? FDR or Ike?
I don't think he was portraying either of them. Maybe Truman. Truman was kind of hard ass. He's not. FDR was a lot more devious
Yeah.
than this guy is, and I don't think. I mean, maybe Eisenhower as a general was kind of hard nosed, but I think he was also a little bit more straightforward. And I can't believe that Eisenhower would have been as ruthless as this president was to push through the nomination, even though he had a communist past and someone had committed suicide over it.
Well, so the way I delineated it, and again, this was part of what I liked about the movie because it was fun to do this. And of course, it's a ridiculous project in a way because they're all meant to be composite
Right, right.
figures and all that. But FDR was dying.
Yeah,
FDR had he didn't know Truman at all, had no idea whether Truman would be prepared to take over from him, and wanted could conceivably want a strong Secretary of State, like a Dean Acheson, for example, um, type of person. And and FDR was on the ship. I was always taking ships to places, and there was a major scene in this film where he's on a ship and a Navy ship, holding meetings and all that. And the big tell is that all during his fatal illness, like this president, he smoked like a chimney. FDR did,
right.
and never quit. Whereas Eisenhower did quit before he became president. Also smoked like a chimney. On the Eisenhower side, um, he was known not to think that highly of Richard Nixon
Right.
during the vice presidential days. Later on, he gained more respect. And you could see Eisenhower um, was actively looking around for who his successor might be other than Nixon. So I think there were similarities in both.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's a composite.
Yeah.
I'm just going to mention that Lou Ayres was the vice president. Lou Ayres was a guy who had a very, very good movie career in the 40s, and he was a conscientious objector. and basically his tanked his career by refusing to join the military and sign up like all the other patriotic movie stars did. And Otto Preminger basically got him off the scrap heap to be in this.
Yeah. And Gene Tierney too,
Gene
who got
Tierney,
her
yeah,
off the scrap heap,
right,
who played the mistress of the Senate Majority Leader.
right, and not off the scrap heap was Betty White,
Yeah,
who played the young women senator. That was her first role.
yeah. One scene, I think.
One scene.
Yeah, and Peter Lawford is in this movie,
Oh, that's right, Peter
who at the
Lawford.
very time the movie was made was JFK's brother-in-law. So it was seen as kind of a suck up. But more interesting to me is he ended up voting against the nominee in a surprise vote. So he in favor of hardline anti-communism, which JFK was. He actually ran to the right of Eisenhower Nixon in the campaign in 1960 on defense and communism issues. And we got to see in one of Senator Smith, Peter Lawford's character, who is modeled after JFK, a young woman emerging from his hotel room in the morning.
Well, the difference was that Peter Lawford's character was unmarried,
And
whereas
they made damn sure to point that out.
exactly.
Yeah. I want to
Uh,
say a couple other things about the cast.
okay,
Um, First of all, there was a lot of art imitating life in the cast. There was a fair amount of real life gayness
right.
amongst the cast. Walter Pidgeon, Will Geer, Charles Lawton were all believed. Well, Geer admitted it, but they were all believed to have, bisexual lives. Maybe Drury himself. Richard Nixon opined about that on the White House tapes in a affirmative certitude sort of way about Drury's sexual preferences, and a lot of real life communists. Will Geer, Burgess Meredith, who played the Whittaker Chambers character. So we've got art imitating life here. And then the last thing I'll say about the cast, and most astounding to me, it's pretty reliably ascertained that both Martin Luther King and Richard Nixon were offered parts in this movie. Martin Luther King was offered the part of playing a Southern senator, even though there were not any African American Southern senators or any senators, I don't believe,
Any
at
senator.
that time. And Richard Nixon was offered the part of the vice president. Now, this was 62. This would have been before he ran for governor, but when he was already out of office. And supposedly Nixon refused because he nitpicked the script and said that the vice president would not have been in a position to break the tie because they had already just been told that the president had died. Therefore, the vice president was no longer in a position of authority as the president of the Senate. However, I have a feeling there were some other issues, but it's fun to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way he ever would have taken that role because the vice president is shown in this movie to be completely irrelevant.
And
And
can you imagine a Richard Nixon playing a character who said, "As I don't ever want to be president"? Never, not on
no one
your
would ever
life.
buy that.
But
No one would
it's
buy
just
that.
interesting to imagine.
I actually did not know that Nixon was offered that part. I knew about Martin Luther King, which sounds kind of crazy. I mean, a black senator from the South.
Oh, it was tokenism on
Yeah,
the director's part.
yeah, yeah. Okay, let's turn to the history. Um, you know, since this is a work of fiction, we can't really nitpick on the technical historical accuracy of how they depicted Leffingwell's life. But so let's focus on how accurate it felt culturally. And we can rely on our own memories here. Does it accurately depict the political world of the 1960s?
Well, I'm a little conflicted here because I think to me it seemed more like the world of the late 40s and 50s.
Right.
as portrayed in the early 60s.
Yeah.
So there's sort of it's sort of a mishmash. But as far as I know, and as far as I've read, I think it I think it rang true for me. There were some Hollywood effects there, like big senators learning of a nominee from the front page of a newspaper. Even in those days, I doubt that would have happened. Or the senator hopping off the Washington, D.C. city bus on his way up to Capitol Hill. Um, but overall, I felt like I was in the world that I think I know.
I agree with you. The thing that was struck me as the most realistic, as we already talked about this, is how the two parties were not broken down into ideological groups. I mean, nowadays it's impossible to imagine that there'd be any crossover that a Republican would, and there'd be Republican and Democratic votes on both sides of an issue. I just, especially in the Senate, the most liberal Republican is still far more conservative than the most conservative Democrat.
Yeah,
So I'm also going to note that these parties, I mean, as a consequence of that, these parties were only identified as the majority and minority party. It wasn't really clear whether the president was a Democrat or not. I think we can assume that the majority party was, because Seep Cooley is from South Carolina and he's in the majority party, and there were no Republicans. They're all
right.
from the South. I think the general ambiance of this communist hysteria is correct. I mean, we remember the country was consumed by fears of communism for about 20 years. We were concerned about Soviet influence. But the movie actually underplays that hysteria, which actually died down a bit by 1962 when the movie came out. If this movie had been made a year later, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the JFK assassination, I think that hysteria would have been even more present.
It would have, but also more present would have been the idea that, hey, we've just got to find a way to live with the Soviets, because, and you saw the biggest change in Kennedy himself,
Yeah.
who, as I said, ran to the right of Eisenhower Nixon in 60, but then really, I think, got shaken to his core by, first of all, the failure of the Bay of Pigs, which led him to question, well, what can we really do? And secondly, and more importantly, by the Cuban Missile Crisis. And
Right.
so started making all those, flowery speeches about we're going to have to start having arms agreements and such.
Yeah. I would say also that the gay panic presented in this movie was real. I recently read a book called Secret City, which is all about the history of the homosexual intolerance in Washington, especially in the post-war period when it was believed that a gay person could be blackmailed into betraying his country. You already mentioned that Brig Anderson is based on Senator Lester Hunt of Wyoming. This book, Secret City, makes it clear that both parties used homosexuality as a way to attack their adversaries. The most obvious case being Roy Cohn, who is Joe McCarthy's right-hand man. In the 1950s, all the liberal heroes took their shots at Cohn by implying that he was doing favors for a friend in the Navy because they were lovers. What did you think about the first gay scene in the movie, the gay bar scene in the movie? Was Preminger being an ally or trying to be sensationalistic?
I think actually a little of both. I think he wanted to be edgy.
Yeah,
That was the premium, is let's be edgy. Even in the scene with the very solid statesman-like majority leader and his mistress. Look at the things they had her saying. I'm a bitch. I mean, this was in 1962, saying those things. So I think he was trying to be sensationalist, but it was also showing a kind of tragedy, and not just the senator who killed himself, but his ex boyfriend who ended up like falling down in the gutter as he was chasing after a person he actually liked. I mean, it was sad. It was pathetic,
yeah,
and so I think we skipped over this when we talked about who would be interested in this movie. I think people who are interested in the evolution of the whole gay set of issues would be interested in this movie, how it was portrayed, what it was like back then, all that kind of thing.
I think as often is the case when you're trying, when a director or an artist is trying to be an ally and be a little bit sympathetic, 60 years later, you get criticized by the people that you're supposedly allied with. I think I've read that gay activists today sort of look on that scene as stereotypical,
Right.
um,
Making fun of them.
making fun of them, trying to exploit them for, the shock value of what the gay bar was like. I would imagine, though, that that scene portrayed in there was fairly accurate. I mean, there's nothing really shocking about it other than they were all men, and they were playing jazz or something.
Yeah, and the first, you know, gay clubs in Manhattan were more like piano bar type clubs, not the raving discos and loud flashy music and all that. And none of them had windows, glass
Right,
windows, you
right,
know,
right.
for many years.
Yeah.
So
I'm also going to say, I'm not sure about the actual committee process in this movie. They appoint a special committee to take testimony instead of bringing it to the full committee.
yeah,
Um, that was a plot device and was not common even then, as far as I can tell. I don't think they used to set up these special committees. And the other thing too is, I guess we're supposed to believe that since there were questions about Leffingwell's communist ties, there needed to be a special committee or something. But I don't really buy it. Plus, the process is really out of whack with senators who are not on the committee, like Cooley and Van Ackerman, able to pop in and ask questions.
yeah, I think that was Hollywood. That
Yeah,
was Hollywood. It was kind of like a J6 committee, wasn't it?
right.
Hollywood.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and finally, I just want to say there's been suggestions that Leffingwell, the nominee, was based on Alger Hiss, who
Hmm.
who was outed by the House and Un-American Committee in the 1940s by then Congressman Nixon's subcommittee as a communist spy. I think a more accurate reference is to Louis Strauss, whose confirmation hearing we saw depicted in the movie Oppenheimer. Like Strauss, Leffingwell is the head of a couple of important sounding government agencies, the Office of Federal Power and the Office of Policy Mobilization. And like Strauss, many senators hold a grudge against him for his arrogance and refusal to compromise and play ball. I mean, they just didn't like him personally. It wasn't really on policy grounds. So I searched Louis Strauss and advised consent and found zero evidence for this theory.
Yeah,
But
I think there's some ties there, and I think, but it's more likely to me to be Hiss with some Dean Acheson thrown in, and you did have a Whittaker Chambers character come forth,
right,
um, who was a former communist turned almost a right winger, and who had some mental problems and such.
yeah. All right, let's talk about our favorite scenes.
All right.
What do you got?
Well, I referenced it already. I like the near the beginning when Senator Cooley, started to make a speech and it was all syrupy, and then it suddenly turned strident and vicious. And to me, up to that point, this was pretty much a process, slice of life kind of movie. And you know how movies sometimes have surprise endings? I thought this movie had a surprise beginning right then
Yeah,
and there. So I like that scene.
this is set up this way and it works out for me. But I thought the scene at the end when they were voting on the confirmation was pretty exciting.
Yeah, a lot going on. A lot
Yeah,
going
tension grew as you couldn't tell which side was going to win. And it was especially satisfying when they repudiate Van Ackerman, the liberal peacenik, for his bad behavior. I thought the ending was pretty good, as much as I objected to the hokey part where the president dropped dead right at the exact right moment.
on. I like the hearing as it you pointed out, it might not be accurate historically or procedurally, but I thought it was I thought it was substantive. I mean, and the questioning on the part of various senators was pretty clever. I mean, a very good lawyering, if you will,
Hmm.
in terms of cross examination. And so I just enjoyed that. I enjoyed seeing each senator's style of questioning and how it played out.
Yeah, the most implausible part of the movie was that the hearing only lasted about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, too bad it isn't more true today. And I like the scene on the ship with the president in his bathrobe smoking, the dying president. And by the way, Ike was during his illnesses was often filmed in the bathrobe.
Yeah.
Um, and where the president's meeting with the majority leader and the vice president, and then at one point dismisses the vice president so he can talk to the majority leader on his own.
Yeah.
Again, I enjoyed that scene, and of course the floozy leaving the JFK type senator's room. I have to note.
Well, speaking of the vice president, I was actually interested in the scene where the vice president offered to help out and no one takes him seriously. I mean, this poor guy was just blown off as like, yeah, yeah, whatever. Uh,
Yeah,
it's very true back then. And even now, some vice presidents are left out in the cold, including the last two vice presidents, Pence and Harris. They were
that's so far, not the current one.
not the current one,
So
for
far.
sure. So far, yeah.
I thought the Senator Brigham Anderson confrontation with the titan of a president scene
Yeah.
was pretty good. And it really underscored that there was really only one hero in this movie. And it was a tragic, flawed hero.
Yeah.
And that was him to stand up, a senator of your own, the president's own party. And if it was an FDR titan, to stand up to him like that was pretty gutsy.
Yeah, it's a very dramatic scene in the book. I remember that I do remember. I didn't think that Henry Fonda did a very good job in this movie, but I thought it was touching when his son learns that his father isn't completely the hero we thought, and Fonda has to sit down to talk to him about it.
Yeah,
That was kind of touching.
yeah.
Favorite lines.
Well, Fonda to his son after he told his son to tell, was it the president that
Yeah.
I'm not in right now? He said, son said, you're lying. I said, well, it's a Washington, D.C. kind of lie. That's when the person knows you're lying and you know he knows. Boy, is that ever true?
I was actually my favorite line too. I think it's Steve Cooley who says about Leffingwell. He's not only an appeaser, he's a spendthrift. He can throw more money out the back door than the government can bring in with a shovel.
There's two lines I liked mainly because they hearken to issues that are relevant today. And the one is Peter Lawford character asks, does the senator think he knows more than the president about who he needs as Secretary of State? And that's relevant today. And maybe we'll talk about it in a moment about what should be the purpose of the confirmation process.
Right.
And then the second one is Van Ackerman says, you want to see us get bombed out of existence for some two-bit Slavic country? That's relevant today because that is the argument that some of the anti-Ukraine
Right.
people
Right. I
make.
mean, that argument has been deployed by both liberals and MAGA
Right.
against
Right.
the Yukons.
So
Yeah.
I like those lines for relevance.
Okay, I've got two lines from the two female characters here. So the hostess to her lover, the majority leader says, when the majority leader says he's old, he says, "Oh, you're old age. You're as virile as a billy goat and make noises like a wounded spaniel." What?
I know that's
I mean, you're right, but
Preminger again. That's
like
Preminger again.
I
But
know, like,
isn't that also proof positive that the majority leader is modeled after LBJ?
well, did he make noises like
I don't know. I don't want to know.
a wounded sparrow? And then Betty White rather, when Van Ackerman asked if she's calling him a liar during debate, she says, The record must stand as it is, Mr. President. How the senator interprets it is his problem, not mine. I mean, she sounds just like Sue Ann Nivens there.
I know. Oh, Murray.
Um,
I thought a very dark line by Van Ackerman. There are ways to frighten any man.
yeah, yeah.
Very, very dark, especially in the context of this movie and the times that it was in which it was made.
The vice president says, being vice president isn't a crime. They can't put you in jail for it, but it's sort of a disgrace, like living in a mansion with no furniture. Is there anything else?
No.
Okay. So, what's the relevance or comparison to politics and society today?
Well, putting aside the shallowness that I detected, I think the whole question of internationalism versus America first, negotiation, even accommodation versus confrontation, those issues are very relevant today. We're debating them all the time. Also, what kind of Senate do we want? Were the good old days of the Senate Club really so good? I think, do we want a Senate where it's go along, get along between the parties? Or do we want differences clearly delineated so that people can make their choices about the issues? And then I think importantly, the issue of how much deference should there be to presidential nominees? I think we've seen an erosion in the decades since this film was made of any bipartisanship in a lot of the votes on nominees from Supreme Court to cabinet officers. And I think it's a very good question as to what our expectations should be there.
Well, the name of the movie is Advise and Consent, which
Right.
are two separate things. Advise implies the Senate has some sort of agency, and consent means rubber stamp. So,
Yeah, I think it's a very relevant issue. And so let me ask you, if you were a senator, what would your basic posture be? I'll answer it first. I'd like to say that I would give deference to the president on cabinet because those are his advisors.
Right.
I wouldn't give deference on Supreme Court justices because those are lifelong members of a third independent branch of government, and where philosophy matters much more over the long haul than who a president's senior advisors are. So that's sort of how I'd like to portray it. But I have to tell you, if I was actually there these days, I'd probably vote against every cabinet member of the opposite party president and for every cabinet member of president of my own party. But what about you? How do you see that issue?
I would not vote against every cabinet member of the opposite president. I would not vote against every Democrat who is nominated.
Okay.
Just out of partisan spite. I wouldn't do that because first of all, I'd want to reserve the right to say that they should vote for my guy when my guy's president. Because otherwise, if you didn't, you'd have no cabinet at all approved if the Senate wasn't the same party as your own.
Yeah.
I agree the Supreme Court is different. I would basically give the president of my own party more leeway than I would the other party, but I think I would expect a certain amount of competence
Yeah.
and ideological consistency. But on the other hand, in the end, it all boils down to politics. You know, if I'm in the first year of my term, a 6-year term, and I'm not about to be primaried, I might be more independent than I was if I was in my 5th year of the term. So
it's interesting that even in this day and age, Marco Rubio got confirmed unanimously. I mean, I think there was an absence or two.
Yeah.
And then subsequent to that, your senator, Chris Murphy, was engaged in a big battle with Rubio and during a hearing.
Yeah.
And Murphy said, well, I regret that I ever voted for you. And of course, then Rubio said, well, now I know I'm doing a good job. So, but there are cases where a nominee
Yeah.
even by a president absolutely reviled by the opposition party, will get a significant number of votes,
Well,
but
it
not
helps
very
if
often.
it helps if you're already in the club,
Exactly.
because every senator thinks he's about to be appointed to Secretary of State, and they want everyone else to get to vote for them. Uh,
Yeah.
I would say the movie's also relevant because we still practice the politics of personal destruction, except now it's not shameful to get caught smearing someone like it was then. If your opponent digs up any dirt on you, they will. I'm thinking particularly of two confirmation hearings, the Clarence Thomas hearing, which he was accused of sexually harassing Anita Hill, and Brett Kavanaugh hearing, in which he was accused of sexual assault as a teenager. In both cases, the opponents and supporters of the nominees were accused of smearing each other. And this will probably get worse before it gets better. So that part has not changed at all since back then.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you can get away with having done more smearable stuff than you could in the past.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It used to be shameful if you were caught. I mean, in this case, Van Ackerman is like basically not kicked out of the Senate, but I have a feeling he might get denounced,
Censured. Yeah.
censured. Yeah. So could this movie be made today?
Well, I think there'll always be a market for big, dark political thrillers with lots of nefarious characters and both real and imagined conspiracies. I mean, the streaming services are full of them. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, you could totally make a movie about a high stakes confirmation hearing, except that the sin wouldn't be soft on communism. It might be wearing a sombrero on Cinco de Mayo or something like that. All right. If you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
No, it's not. It's just not connected enough to real history lessons, even though it's very interesting from a
Yeah.
historical standpoint.
Yeah, it's too old fashioned. It would take too much work to figure out what's going on. It would be. I mean, it's hard for us to follow. I can't imagine like a high school senior being able to figure it out.
Yeah.
All right, what would you grade the movie?
I'd give it a B. I enjoyed the movie. I enjoyed this kind of movie, and but it just didn't dig deep enough into the characters and into the issues and into their motives.
Okay, I would also give it a B. So we're on the same page for once.
That's unusual
I
because
know.
I think in general, I tend to. I mean, you like the really historic classic movies as
Yeah.
much as I do, but in general, I tend to like old-fashioned potboiler type movies and just below A level movies, B movies more than you do. I'm more
Yeah.
patient and more forgiving for their old-fashionedness.
Yeah, I'm less forgiving on like we're in historical stuff.
Yeah.
And maybe it helped this movie didn't have any historical record for me to nitpick. Okay. Anything else you want to say about the movie before we close here?
No, I think we've said it all.
All right. Well, I want to ask everyone, as usual, to subscribe to the program, subscribe to this podcast, which is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. If you have comments, you can email me at garyholmes76@gmail. Our next movie, we're going to do something different. We're going to do a musical, and that musical is going to be Hamilton, which has two singing presidents, Washington and Jefferson.
Oh boy.
Oh boy.
I'm going to defer to my host and actually watch that thing.
Okay.
And I'll keep an open mind.
Keep an open mind, yes. If you haven't seen Hamilton, you can see it on, what is it, Disney Plus or something. Yeah, Disney Plus is where you can see it. But
sure you don't want to do 1776 instead?
maybe
The
we can do
musical.
both. Compare and
No,
contrast.
please, Gary, please. I've never seen it. I don't want to.
All right. We'll see you later, Jim.
Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Pump water politicians think the world's like. You want to get us bombed out of existence for some lousy two-bit country in Lower Slobovia that can't even feed itself?
Director Preminger's cameras board a warship in Chesapeake Bay to film a scene of political crisis.
I don't know, Mr. President. When last night I saw Brig Anderson, I saw a man in terrible pain. I wonder if Leffingwell or any one man is worth all of this.
Jean Tierney returns to motion pictures as Washington's most talked-about hostess. The setting for her lavish party is the famous estate of a former ambassador to Russia. Among the guests, you may recognize government officials and leaders of Washington society who play themselves. All sides of Washington life pass before the camera lens, from the hubbub of the social world to the suburban homes that appear so quiet from the outside.
Awful creature on the telephone. He knows what he's talking about. He's not making something up. Now, something's going to happen if you don't do what he wants, and you've got to prepare me.
He's dead.
Break.
In his office. Cut his throat.